Hello, my friends. Thank you for clicking on this video. This would be my first official ASMR soft-spoken ramble video. When I've been watching ASMR for a couple of years now, but the ramble video was always a little bit weird to me because I never saw too many of them. I'm not sure if they've been around since the beginning or if they're relatively new, but I thought ramble videos were like my review videos where you just talk about something. However, I came to realize fairly recently that seems like, at least in my view, ramble videos are often unscripted videos where you're talking about something seemingly random and not in a series like I do with my review videos. For a number of early review videos, I would call them rambles for a couple of reasons, because I thought that's what they were, and I also thought that would help in the algorithm, but that obviously is not true. So, in my recent review video of Sleepaway Camp, I mentioned that I don't really like older horror movies because of certain aspects of them, and I feel like I wanted to clarify what that meant in a ramble video. I said that 70s movies and 80s movies had certain aspects of them that would basically combine better in the 21st century. I think I should explain what I mean by that. In my view, in the 70s, it feels like horror movies were more realistic and more gritty, but were really cheap and raw and really hard to watch because of how not amateurish but cheap they were. Movies like Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave are great examples of this. You can totally see those scenarios happen to someone. Actually, for all I know, maybe they are based on true stories. I don't know. But while they are realistic and I can totally see them happen to someone, the issue I have is that they aren't well made and they completely take you out of any immersion, at least for me. Not only are they cheaply shot and edited, but often the acting is subpar at best and often completely worthless. And I think that's the problem I have, is that the fact that it looks cheap. Now in the 80s, it seems like they did a complete 180. They were much better made, but the issue is that they weren't very realistic. I like the looks of movies like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. And on Nightmare on Elm Street, there are some really good effects. But the issue is that it's hard for me to get immersed because I can't really see myself in those situations. Like, there's no time I'll ever be chased by a reincarnated serial killer, or will I ever be killed in a nightmare by a monster. And yes, I know that the first Friday 13th is not Voorhees, I know. And now, I know it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre that is based on a true event, but I do think it takes some liberties. And again, part of the reason it's hard for me to get immersed is because too many characters in horror movies are unnaturally stupid. Now, in the 90s, honestly, I'm not sure how the 90s horror was. The only one I know that was 90s was Scream. Now, there probably are other ones I know of, I just don't know they were in the 90s. So please comment down below if there are any, big, good 90s horror movies that I just don't remember. If I'm going by Scream, if that was the, big horror movie that a lot of horror movies copied, it would seem like the 90s would be an era where horror tried to go more mainstream. And with that means, unfortunately, cliches. And the reason I think a lot of people like horror is because they tend to avoid cliches when they can. Well, what I mean by that is, cliches that aren't part of any other genre. Like in many genres, whether it be comedy or fantasy or drama, whatever, one big cliche is like, if there's a man and a woman who hate each other, by the end they will end up being lovers. Horror movies tend to avoid those kind of cliches, and of course, in avoiding them, they create all new ones, which I've talked about in numerous review videos. But after 21st century, once effects started to become more mainstay, it seemed like horror movies got into a good balance where not only are they um, better made, but they are, for the most part, realistic. And I don't think they have to be realistic to be good or even immersive. For instance, I saw Child's Play, and I think that's a pretty good movie. And I saw The Descent, and while that's not the most realistic, it is easy to get immersed because while you're probably not going to find a humanoid creature to chase you, you can get stuck in a cave. And yeah, technically, you could find a humanoid creature that we have not discovered yet. So, now, a lot of people call themselves horror movie fans, and I think I'm a little different. I call myself a horror movie hunter. And in that regard, I mean that I'm searching for, I guess, a thrill in a horror movie. It's hard for me to really get invested in a horror movie because my mind, I guess, has been so desensitized over the years. Like, my parents were pretty lenient, for the most part, on the media I consumed when I was younger. Basically, if it didn't have any language or sex and nudity, anything was pretty much on the table. And video games are even more lenient. I was playing rated T games when I was 8 years old, so I think that's because I like when I get hypnotized into a movie, because that's its job. If the movie can hypnotize you into believing that these characters are real, then the movie is doing its job. And for me, pretty much every genre of movie doesn't do that for me. I will often appreciate movies for for good writing and for great storytelling, like a lot of the 90s Disney movies I grew up with that still hold up very well today. But I don't get immersed. I started really getting into horror movies a couple of years ago after I realized how immersive horror video games were. I played games like Fear and Dungeon Nightmares, and they immerse you very well. Often I would sweat when I was playing those because I felt like I was really there. So, so I often thought to myself, well, can't horror movies do the same for me? So I started watching some mini horror movies the last few years, uh, and the problem is that I realized how hard that was going to be because even though the 21st century, I think they've gotten a little better at making horror movies, it the problem becomes with the writing and many other aspects. And I think more now than maybe back then is that many horror movies fall into numerous cliches, including some that aren't as well known that I see in like found footage movies. And I started watching found footage movies because um, it the setup is immediately prone to hypnotization because it's like it's already trying to convince you that it's real. It's just a compilation of clips that a director happened to find. And I think I started watching those because it's like that's such a good idea. Unfortunately, I realized pretty quickly how um why they are so disliked for the most part. They have potential to be so immersive, but it falls back into the 70s trap of just being cheap. Often the acting is subpar at best, and the writing just drags on. I'm noticing with numerous found footage movies I've seen on Tubi and on YouTube for free that many of them follow the same cliches that I will talk about that I have talked about in my other found footage reviews, and I will talk about in future found footage reviews. But anyway, basically, it's hard for me to get into 70s and 80s movies because of how cheap. Well, some of them look cheap and some of them just aren't realistic. And for me to get into a horror movie, I have to be able to imagine myself in that situation. Nightmare on Elm Street is really well done, and I guess kinda intrinsically frightening, but I lose immersion because it's not going to happen. I'm never going to be in a situation while my life is on the line from a nightmare. That's just not plausible. And when it comes to like I spit on your grave, it certainly is scary. And if a character is really going through that, obviously you try to save them. Even if I can't, like I'm not a female, obviously, so I can't imagine myself specifically in that situation. Now, I mean, if I watched Deliverance, I would, but I don't see myself going to that situation. So it's while it's hard for me to immerse myself directly, I can I would be able to immerse myself indirectly because it's like, well, if I knew someone that's going through that, I would do all I can to save them. And I think a great example of that, in a way, would be the movie The Girl Next Door, the one on Sylvia Likens. I can't imagine myself in Meg's position, but I certainly can imagine myself in Dave's position, where I want to help her, but for some reason I just can't. And I Spit on Your Grave could kind of do that indirectly. The issue is it's so poorly made that I'm not convinced that's really happening. And I think that's the problem with some of these movies, is that early movies, I don't recall any that are in between, and that's partly because I think at the time horror was not a mainstream interest, so people didn't put as much effort into it. Now I could be wrong. I wasn't even alive when those movies came out, so I'm a 2000s kid, so that's probably why I don't know them very well. Now, I started watching Tubi because it's free and it had a lot of like non-mainstream horror movies. Now, mainstream is not a bad thing. Pretty much 90% of anything any media anybody consumes would be mainstream. And I've seen some good mainstream horror movies, but the problem is it seems like horror movies in the mainstream don't tend to go into areas that non-mainstream movies do. For instance, Scream was very mainstream, and is basically a guy in a mask chasing teenagers. While like the Human Centipede is not mainstream, and it goes into much more disturbing content. I Spit on Your Grave obviously is another one. So that's why I like Tubi, because it's free and it wasn't going to mainstream. And I decided to do ASMR reviews, mostly because I wanted to get into the community because of how much it gave back to me, and I think I discussed that in my intro video. So that's pretty much why. I do mostly horror movies because not only do a lot of people like horror movies, but I always like to hunt for that thrill. I have found them. For instance, movies like The Bay or The Girl Next Door, or even Frozen to a degree, do that for me. And even ones that don't necessarily do that, I still enjoy. Like, for instance, No Solicitors, I gave a high score because while it wasn't very immersive, it was pretty funny, and I could watch it and enjoy it. Now, that's all I really wanted to discuss. I just mainly wanted to clarify why I said what I said. Now, when it came to Sleepaway Camp specifically, I won't go into detail because you can watch that review. You can watch that review anytime to get a full detailed review as to my thoughts. But basically, I didn't really like it. I don't really see why a lot of people like it. But it seems like, for me, not being able to get involved into horror movies, good or bad, is more of a curse than a blessing. I could not get immersed simply because of the poor production quality, even though the setup was fairly realistic. Now that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for listening to my ramble. If you like my videos, please subscribe and click that notification bell if you actually want to get notified when I subscribe. If you want to see updates to my uploads, as well as my cultural hot takes, please leave a link in the description below. If you have any topics you want me to cover in a future ramble, or any movies that you want me to review in the future, please leave a comment down below or email me. Address will be in the description below. Until next time, thank you for watching, and God bless.